High above the mortal world, Olympus glowed under pale lightning, and the air around its white towers felt thin and sacred. The halls of the gods were always loud with power, yet that night a deep wrongness moved through every stone, every cloud, and every golden beam of light. Zeus, the king of the gods, stood on the highest terrace with his storm staff in hand, and he could feel the balance of the worlds shaking like a drum under a cracked skin. The cause was hidden inside the celestial blade, a weapon forged in the first storm before memory, before kings, before law. That blade was meant to guard the order of heaven and earth, but now it had fractured, and each shard carried a piece of its ancient force. If the shards stayed apart, the laws of Olympus would unravel, the sea would rise in fury, the sky would twist into black flame, and the mortal world would lose its steady shape. Zeus understood the danger at once, but he also saw the deeper problem. He could not simply strike the threat and end it. The blade had split because old pride, old rules, and old grudges had made the world too rigid to hold its own power. Somewhere in the storm, a hidden hand had pushed the fracture wider, and the one thing that could find the shards was a young spirit guide named Iris, a girl with bright silver hair, clear blue eyes, and a quiet bond to thunder itself. Iris was small, brave, and very new to the halls of the gods, but the lightning answered her in ways it did not answer anyone else. She wanted to prove she was not just a messenger, and Zeus needed her because the shards would only reveal themselves to someone who could hear their pulse. The king of the gods looked down at her and knew the first trial had already begun. Iris stepped forward in a short white cloak lined with blue thread, her silver hair lifting in the storm wind, and her face stayed serious even though she could feel the fear in her chest. Zeus told her the truth in plain words because there was no room for doubt now. If the celestial blade was not restored, the order of Olympus would break apart, the ocean would lose its borders, the underworld would open wider, and storms would roam the mortal world without rest. Iris listened, and she did not run. That courage mattered because the first shard had already fallen into the deep sea, where Poseidon ruled. Zeus knew Poseidon would not help from kindness, because Poseidon had long resented how Zeus carried the crown of sky while demanding obedience from every realm. Poseidon wanted respect, and he wanted proof that Olympus still cared about the sea instead of only using it as part of its map. So Zeus and Iris descended through a dark rain gate and reached the shore city of Harbor Point, where the sea had already turned black and restless. There they found Poseidon standing on a broken pier, tall and broad, with long blue hair, a dark green cloak, and a trident that flashed like ice under the storm. He was angry, proud, and impossible to ignore. He told Zeus that the sea was under pressure, that strange currents were pulling his gates open, and that he would not help unless Zeus admitted that the sky had been careless for too long. Zeus did not like the terms, but he could see the truth in Poseidon's eyes. The first shard had stirred below the waves, and if they wanted it, they would need Poseidon guidance through the trenches where even sea spirits refused to swim. Iris touched the broken pier, heard a faint thunder hum under the water, and pointed toward a whirlpool that had not been there before. Poseidon followed, and together the three of them entered the sea realm just as the storm above began to spread its black wings. Below the waves, the sea was full of dim blue light, sharp coral towers, and deep pressure that pressed against thought itself. The shard had awakened an ancient trial, and the water around it became a maze of moving walls, sudden drops, and hidden currents that shifted when anger rose. Poseidon led them through the maze, but every step tested his patience, because the sea itself seemed to ask whether he would protect balance or use the chaos to claim more power. Iris stayed close to Zeus, listening for the shard, and she discovered that thunder inside her could answer only when she spoke honestly. When she admitted that she was afraid of failing both the gods and the mortal world, a pulse of lightning flashed through her palms and lit a path through the dark. That path led them to the first shard, floating inside a shell of storm glass, guarded by shape-like waves that struck at anything that touched the water. Zeus tried to seize it, but the guard forms overwhelmed him and forced him back. Poseidon then understood what the shard wanted. It was not strength alone, it was trust. He had to join his power to Zeus without trying to dominate it. That was a hard truth for him, but he gave it. His trident drove a clean current through the maze, Zeus called down a steady bolt, and Iris guided the strike with her thunder sense. The shell broke apart, the first shard rose into the air, and the sea calmed for one brief moment. But before they could celebrate, the shard flashed with a strange image inside it. Zeus saw a figure in the distance, cloaked in storm shadow, reaching toward the broken blade long before the fracture had spread. It was not an accident. Someone had been waiting for the moment of weakness, and someone wanted the law of Olympus to fail. That revelation changed everything, because now the mission was no longer only repair, it was also discovery. The shard led them next toward the mountain roads above the mortal world, where the air turned cold and the clouds hung low over ruined temples and silent forests. Hera met them there, and her arrival changed the mood at once. She was the queen of Olympus, sharp-eyed, calm, and hard to fool, with long black hair, a gold crown, and a white and crimson robe that moved like a banner in the wind. Hera did not trust the easy promises of Zeus, because she knew how often he chose order when he should have chosen wisdom. She wanted the world to remain stable, but she also wanted the truth of what had been broken for so long. Zeus needed her help to read the old sky marks hidden on the mountain, and Hera needed him to stop treating her warnings like noise. The second shard rested inside an ancient storm altar on the ridge, but the altar woke a trial of memory. It showed every old mistake of Olympus, every harsh rule, every time power had been chosen over care. Zeus saw himself as the center of all law, and for the first time he looked ashamed. Iris stood nearby and saw something else. She saw that the shard was reacting not to strength but to change. The blade had been forged in the first storm to keep the worlds connected, but the law built around it had become too rigid, too proud, and too afraid of difference. Before they could reach the shard, shadow spirits flooded the ridge, drawn by the break in the heavens. Hera held the line with clear commands, Zeus fought through the storm with raw thunder, and Iris followed the shard song until she found the one true step through the altar path. When the second shard lifted into her hands, the mountain trembled and the storm above them widened into a dark ring. In that moment, a greater truth began to show itself. The blade had not simply shattered. It had been struck from the inside by a force that knew the old order was weak. And if the remaining shards were gathered carelessly, the reborn blade might restore the same broken laws instead of healing them. That fear drove the journey toward the underworld, where the final trail had sunk into smoke, stone, and cold red light. Hades waited in his dark kingdom beneath the earth, and unlike Poseidon or Hera, he spoke little but missed nothing. He was tall, severe, and still, with dark brown hair, a black cloak, and eyes that seemed to measure every secret in the room. Hades wanted one thing above all else, for the dead and the hidden things to remain in their proper place. The spreading storm was disturbing the boundaries of his realm, and the souls under his care were growing restless. He told Zeus that one shard had fallen into the river of echoes, where old vows and buried lies could return as living storms. Zeus wanted speed, but Hades demanded honesty. That was his price for help. Iris, who had grown more confident with every trial, answered first. She said the worlds were breaking because no one had been willing to admit that the old order had too many cracks. Her words struck deep because even Hades had no reply at first. Together they crossed into the lowest halls, where black water glimmered under pale fire and lost voices whispered from the walls. There the final shard waited, held inside a cage of shifting shadow. But the cage did not open to force. It opened only when Zeus heard the hidden meaning of the storm. The blade had not chosen Iris by accident. Her spirit was tied to thunder because she had been born from a lightning strike that saved her village during a forgotten storm years before. She was not just a guide. She was a living bridge between divine power and mortal hope, and the blade recognized that bridge as the future of the worlds. Zeus finally understood the full truth of the attack. The one who struck the celestial blade was not trying to destroy everything at random. That force wanted to end a failing order and replace it with something harsher, where only strength would decide who survived. Zeus had spent ages preserving the old laws because he feared change. Now change stood before him, and it wore the face of disaster. As the shadow cage began to open, the black storm above Olympus spread farther than ever before, and the next choice of Zeus would decide whether the heavens would heal, break, or become something new. The final shard rose slowly in Iris' hands, and in the dark silence of the underworld, all three gods felt the same chill. The real enemy was still moving, and the next storm was already on its way. The underworld felt colder than a winter river, and the silence inside it pressed down like stone. Deep below Olympus, where the dead did not speak and the walls held old memories, Iris stood with the final shard trembling in both hands. Iris was the goddess of the rainbow, a woman with golden hair and bright eyes, known for carrying messages between worlds because she wanted peace more than pride. Beside her stood Zeus, the king of the gods, a stern man with thick white hair and a heavy cloak of blue and gold, who had ruled for ages and now feared that changing the old laws would weaken the heavens. On the other side waited Hades, lord of the underworld, a dark-haired man with a black robe and a tired face, who protected the dead and cared deeply about balance, because he knew that every broken rule in Olympus could spill into his realm. The problem was now clear to all three of them. The shadow cage was opening, the black storm above Olympus was spreading, and if the final shard fell into the wrong hands, the gods would lose the last wall between order and ruin. Zeus stared at the shard in Hera's hands, and for one hard moment he did not move. The shard was small, but it carried the same strange power as the others, and its sharp light made the darkness around it bend away. Hades spoke first, his voice low and careful, because he understood that fear made rulers stubborn. He said the cage was not opening by chance, and the storm was not just weather, but a sign that someone was using broken law as a weapon. Iris lifted her head and told Zeus that the shard had answered her call, but it had also shown her something hidden inside the black sky. She had seen lines of power moving behind the storm, like hands pulling a curtain in the dark. Zeus finally admitted the truth that had weighed on him for too long. He had resisted change because he feared that if the old laws were altered, Olympus would lose its identity and become weak enough for any enemy to enter. That fear had not made him cruel, but it had made him slow, and now the enemy was using that delay to push the heavens toward collapse. Before Zeus could speak again, the floor of the underworld shook in one deep wave. A cold wind rushed through the chamber, carrying ash and shadow, and the shadow cage began to open wider. It was a tall shape made of black beams and silver cracks, held together by a spell older than memory. Hades raised one hand and tried to seal the edges, but the cage pushed back as if something inside was breathing against it. Then a voice came from the dark, smooth and calm, and it belonged to a god named Vance, a sharp-eyed man with pale hair and a long dark cloak, who had once served as a keeper of records in Olympus before he turned against the throne. Vance wanted control more than victory because he believed the gods had grown soft, the old laws had become slow, and only fear could force the heavens into a stronger shape. He had hidden his plan behind storms, broken seals, and false warnings, hoping that Zeus would stay trapped in doubt while the cage opened fully. Now his face appeared in the shadow between the bars, not fully here, but close enough to make every heart tighten. He said the final shard belonged to him, because it was the last piece needed to awaken the full storm and make Olympus kneel. Iris stepped back, but she did not lower the shard. Her hands were shaking, yet her voice stayed clear. She told Zeus that Vance had been guiding the storm from the start, feeding on the fear between the gods and using every delay to grow stronger. This was the twist that changed everything, because the real enemy was not a wild disaster at all. It was a clever god who had studied their rules, understood their habits, and used Zeus' own fear of change against him. Zeus felt the truth hit him like thunder in a closed room. He had thought the danger came from change itself, but now he saw that the danger came from refusing to face change until an enemy could shape it first. Hades clenched his jaw and said that if Vance finished the cage, the storm would not stop at Olympus. It would spill into the lands below, disturb the balance of the underworld, and leave both the living and the dead without protection. That was the true stake now, and it made the whole chamber feel smaller and more dangerous. Zeus stepped forward at last, and the movement changed the air around him. His cloak flared, his white hair lifted in the wind, and for the first time in many ages he did not stand like a ruler who had all the answers. He stood like a leader ready to learn. He asked Iris what the shard had shown her, and she answered that the broken laws were not meant to be thrown away, but repaired with care, so they could protect the gods without trapping them in fear. She had seen an older path, one that joined wisdom and change instead of setting them against each other. Zeus looked toward Hades, and Hades gave a single slow nod because he understood that balance did not mean no change, it meant change with limits. Together they formed a new plan. Hades would hold the cage from below, Iris would guide the shard to the opening, and Zeus would use the storm above Olympus to pull Vance into the light where his hidden control could not survive. But even as they moved, the shadow cage jolted again, and a second force inside it struck the bars with enough power to send black sparks across the floor. That hidden force had never shown itself, and now the gods knew Vance was not working alone. The chamber filled with a sudden howl, and the black storm above Olympus answered in return. Far above, thunder rolled across the sky like a giant drum, and lightning flashed through the cloud wall in cold white cuts. Hades drove both hands into the ground and locked the opening of the underworld chamber with a ring of deep blue light, but the strain made his arms tremble. Iris ran to the edge of the seal and held the shard above it, letting its bright power cut through the dark. Zeus rose into the air on a column of lightning, his face hard now, not from anger alone but from resolve. He called out to the storm not as a master forcing obedience, but as a king speaking to a world he finally understood could not be controlled by fear forever. The storm answered with a fierce blast, and Vance appeared fully at last, his pale hair whipping around his face as he stood inside the shadow cage like a prisoner who still thought he was winning. He laughed once and said that Zeus had learned too late. The old laws were already cracking and the heavens were already changing, but Zeus did not deny that. Instead, he said the change would happen by choice, not by deceit. That single answer cut through the chamber harder than any strike, because it showed the king had finally accepted what he had spent so long resisting. Then the second force inside the cage moved again, and its shape became clear. It was not a monster from beneath the world, but a younger god named Caleb, a man with dark brown hair and a torn silver cloak who had once served the courts of Olympus before Vance trapped him inside the cage. Caleb had wanted to expose Vance, but he had been caught and used as bait, because Vance knew that Zeus would never leave a fallen servant behind. That reveal struck the group like a cold wave, and it made Vance seem even more dangerous, because he had not only planned to win, he had planned to hide his cruelty inside lies that felt like duty. Caleb shouted that Vance had one more seal tied to the cage, and if it broke the wrong way, the storm would surge through every gate of Olympus. Zeus made his choice without hesitation. He reached for the shard in Iris' hands, but he did not take it for himself. He placed his palm over hers, sharing the power, and he ordered Hades to open the seal just enough for the truth to pass through. Hades hesitated only a breath, then obeyed. The cage split with a sharp flash, Caleb stumbled out into the light, and the storm above Olympus shook so hard that even the dead in the underworld seemed to hold still. Vance backed away, shocked that Zeus had chosen trust over pride. He had counted on old fear, but he had not expected unity. Still, he was not defeated yet. The shadow at his feet spread wider, and the storm above Olympus answered with one more violent surge. Zeus raised both hands and forced the lightning to bend around the chamber instead of through it. Iris guided the shard into the open seal, and the shard began to glow with a warm, steady light that pushed the shadow back inch by inch. Hades anchored the floor with his dark power, keeping the underworld from splitting under the strain. Caleb, weak but standing, used the last of his strength to name the hidden seal that Vance had used to bind the storm. The name broke the spell in the air, and the cage began to collapse. Vance was driven back into the dark, not destroyed but forced to retreat as the balance of power shifted away from him. Yet the moment did not feel like a clean ending, because the black storm still circled above Olympus, and its center still had one more secret waiting inside it. Zeus looked up through the opening and saw a shape moving in the cloud wall, large and silent, watching him as if it had been there from the very first day. Iris felt the same chill as before, and this time even Hades went quiet. The real enemy was still moving, the next storm was already on its way, and Zeus now understood that saving Olympus would mean facing a power far older than the fear that had ruled him. He stood beside Iris and Hades, no longer alone in his doubt, and he prepared for the next choice that would decide whether the heavens healed, broke, or became something new. The story was not finished, but Zeus had finally begun to change, and that change would now have to survive the storm. The halls of Olympus had gone quiet, but it was not a peaceful quiet, and everyone in the great mountain palace could feel it pressing down like heavy rain before a storm. Broken marble glowed under cold moonlight, banners hung still without wind, and the great golden towers above the clouds looked more like a warning than a home. Zeus stood in the center of that silence, a tall man with thick white hair, sharp blue eyes, and a deep blue cloak edged in gold, and for the first time in a long time he did not feel like the whole world was waiting for him to fail. Beside him stood Iris, a graceful woman with golden hair, bright eyes, and a rainbow-trimmed robe that caught the faint light in soft colors, and her steady calm kept the air from falling apart. On his other side stood Hades, a serious man with black hair, pale skin, and a dark robe, watching everything with tired patience, because he understood that silence often came before a trap. Their enemy was still out there, and the danger was not just one battle, but the chance that Olympus itself would be torn open from the inside. If they did not move soon, the heavens would not simply crack, they would become a doorway for something ancient and hungry. That was the fear in the room, and that was the reason Zeus finally asked the question he had avoided for too long. Who was really behind the shadow cage, and why did it matter so much now? The halls of Olympus felt colder after the last warning, and even the golden light above the marble floors seemed thin and weak. Zeus stood near the broken archway, his thick white hair bright against the dark shadows, his sharp blue eyes fixed on the trembling air where the shadow cage had once been held. Iris stood beside him, her golden hair flowing over her rainbow-trimmed robe, her face calm but tense, because she knew calm could help others breathe when fear began to rise. Hades stood farther back, his black hair tied neatly and his dark robe falling straight around his pale frame, his tired eyes watching everything with quiet care. Caleb, the young servant with dark brown hair and a torn silver cloak, leaned against a pillar with pain in his face, but his jaw stayed firm. Everyone in the chamber understood the same terrible truth now. If the final shard was taken, the shadow cage would not just imprison divine power, it would crack open a path for something ancient and hungry, and Olympus itself could become the door. Zeus had finally asked the question that had been pressing on all of them, and the answer had to come soon, because silence was no longer a pause. It was a trap. Iris was the first to move. She lifted one hand and her soft light spread across the floor in a careful ring, not enough to fight, but enough to reveal hidden marks. The shadow cage was not built in a day, she said, her voice clear and steady. Someone planned this with patience, and that means the enemy knows more about Olympus than we wanted to believe. Hades stepped closer and looked at the silver cracks in the air where the prison had once held. He did not speak at first because he was measuring the danger with the same careful mind that made him feared and trusted at once. Then he said, "The cage was designed to hold divine force, but it was also designed to be opened in pieces. That means the builder wanted control, not only prison." Zeus turned toward him, and the anger in his eyes was sharp, but it was not careless. He wanted truth more than he wanted blame, because blame without truth would only feed the enemy. Caleb swallowed hard, then pushed away from the pillar. He looked small beside the gods, but his voice carried real pain and real purpose. "I heard them speak in the lower halls," he said. Vance was not alone. He had a second voice guiding him, and that voice knew the old paths under Olympus better than I did. The room grew still. That detail changed everything. A second voice meant the danger was deeper, and someone close to the heart of Olympus had already been helping the enemy move in the dark. Zeus asked Caleb to speak every detail, no matter how small, and the young servant did not waste a word. He told them how he had carried sealed lamps through a service tunnel beneath the temple steps, how he had seen pale light move behind a wall that should have been solid stone, and how Vance had stood there with his long dark cloak pulled close around him like a shadow that had learned to walk. Vance, Caleb said, was never loud. He never wasted anger. He watched, waited, and let others make mistakes first. He wanted the final shard because it was the one piece of sacred light that could either seal the ancient force forever or wake it fully if twisted into the wrong hands. That was why he had spent so much time on the shadow cage. The prison was not the goal, it was the lock. If he could force the lock open at the right moment, he could turn the shattered barrier of Olympus into a doorway for power that no god wanted near the world. Hades folded his arms and closed his eyes for a moment. "That ancient force is not a story for children," he said. "It is older than the temples, older than the names of the gods. It waits for weakness and it feeds on broken seals." Iris lowered her gaze because she understood the fear behind those words. A seal was only safe while it was whole, and the final shard was the last thing holding the balance together. Zeus listened, then slowly nodded. The enemy was not trying to win a fight in the open. He was trying to make Olympus do the work for him. Then the real twist came, and it landed harder than any blade could have. Caleb reached into the inside of his torn silver cloak and drew out a small folded strip of dark cloth, wrapped around a sliver of crystal dust that still glowed with a faint inner light. Zeus stepped forward at once, and Iris gasped softly because everyone in the chamber recognized the sign. It was not the final shard itself, but it was a piece of it, a trail left behind. Caleb had not stolen it, he had hidden it. "I found this near the lower gate," he said, his voice shaking now, not from fear alone, but from the weight of what he had kept secret. "I did not tell anyone because I was afraid the wrong person would notice." Zeus looked at him with sharp suspicion, but Caleb shook his head before the accusation could form. "Vance used one of our own to move through the halls," he said. "A woman with golden hair and a messenger robe. She carried notes and she was smiling too much." Iris froze. Her bright eyes widened, and for one silent beat the chamber seemed to stop breathing. Zeus turned slowly toward her, but not with anger. He knew Iris too well to judge by one sentence. Still, the words had cut deep because the enemy had clearly used a trusted face to hide a secret path. Iris raised both hands, her voice gentle but firm. "I have sent messages through every hall of Olympus for years," she said. "If someone used my roots, then they used the trust of my office, not my will." That answer mattered because it showed how Vance moved. He did not only attack walls, he borrowed the shape of trust itself. Zeus believed her, but belief did not erase danger. He turned to Hades and asked the question that had become the center of the whole crisis. Who built the shadow cage, and why did it matter so much now? Hades looked toward the broken archway, and the tired strength in his face deepened into something heavy and old. "It was built by minds that feared Olympus would one day split," he said. "Long ago, some gods believed that fear could be turned into a weapon. They made a prison that could hold divine force and also serve as a hinge between worlds." He paused, then continued in a lower voice. "That is why it matters now. The cage was never only a cage. It was a test of whether the heavens could stay closed under pressure." Zeus clenched his fists. He finally saw the shape of the trap. Vance wanted the final shard because it could complete the broken pattern, and the second voice in the halls was helping him find the old hinge buried under the stones. If the hinge opened, the ancient force outside the seal would not need to break in. It would be invited. That was the true threat, and it was worse than any open battle. Suddenly, a deep pulse rolled through the floor beneath them. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Somewhere below Olympus, a hidden lock had just shifted. Caleb stumbled and caught himself, his face going pale. "That was not me," he said quickly. "I did not touch anything." Iris stepped to his side and placed a steady hand near his shoulder, not touching but close enough to calm him. Zeus lifted his head and listened with his whole body, because rulers did not survive by strength alone. They survived by knowing when the ground was lying. The pulse came again, stronger this time, followed by a low crackling sound from beneath the chamber. Hades turned and spoke one harsh sentence. "He has reached the lower seal." There was no more room for discussion. Zeus understood that Vance had not been waiting outside. He had already moved under their feet. The enemy was closer than anyone had wanted to believe, and every second now could decide whether Olympus remained a home or became a gateway. Zeus drew in a slow breath, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was still strong, but it carried more than force now. It carried trust. "Iris, take Caleb to the East Passage and keep him safe. Hades, come with me below. If Vance has reached the lower seal, then we stop him there." Iris nodded at once, and Caleb looked shocked that Zeus had trusted him so quickly, but that shock slowly turned into relief. Zeus had seen the hidden shard dust in Caleb's cloak, and he had seen fear mixed with honesty. That was enough for now. They moved at once through the echoing halls, and the dark under Olympus waited below like a closed mouth. As they ran, Iris used her rainbow-edged light to mark the safe turns, while Caleb pointed out old service doors that many gods had forgotten. He was still injured, still tired, and still young, but now he was helping in a way that mattered. That was the start of his change, because he was no longer just a trapped servant hoping to survive the night. He was part of the rescue itself. Zeus watched him and saw something important in that simple act. Courage did not always look loud. Sometimes it looked like telling the truth after fear had tried to bury it. Hades stayed beside Zeus, silent and steady, and his black hair moved with the wind from the lower tunnels as they descended. Far below, the floor gave another hard tremor, and a thin line of black light slipped through a crack in the stone. Zeus stopped at the edge of the stairwell, his sharp eyes fixed on that light, and he knew the next fight would not only test his power, it would test the trust he had just chosen to give. Somewhere under Olympus, Vance was waiting, patient and cold, with the final shard within reach and the shadow cage almost ready to open. Yet even now, the gods were not broken. They were moving, they were learning, and for the first time since the silence began, they were seeing the enemy clearly. That was enough to keep the story alive, but not enough to end the danger, because deeper below, the ancient lock had started to turn again. The halls under Olympus were colder now, and the air felt tight as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Broken stone arches leaned over wide black steps, and pale light from distant torches trembled across old walls marked by deep cracks. Above all of it, the ancient lock kept turning somewhere far below, slow and heavy, like a giant hand trying to wake a sleeping danger. Zeus stood at the front of the group, tall and strong, with thick white hair, sharp blue eyes, and a long royal cloak in deep blue and gold. He looked like a king, but his face carried worry because he understood the truth now, and the truth was simple. Vance was close to the final shard, and if the shadow cage opened, Olympus would not just be threatened, it would be changed forever. Beside Zeus moved Iris, a graceful woman with golden hair, bright eyes, and a flowing robe trimmed in rainbow colors. She was calm, but her calm was not weakness, because she had always been the messenger who could cross danger with a clear mind and a loyal heart. Behind them came Hades, a serious man with black hair, pale skin, and a dark robe that seemed to drink in the light. He looked tired but steady, and he had a quiet strength that made even the lower dark seem less cruel. Caleb followed them last, a young man with dark brown hair, a torn silver cloak, and a worn face that showed pain and stubborn hope at the same time. He had once been only a trapped servant of Olympus, but now he carried something much harder than fear. He carried a choice. Zeus had trusted him before, and that trust was still new, still fragile, and still dangerous. The central conflict stood clear now, because if Caleb failed, Vance would gather the final shard, complete the shadow cage, and use both to force the ancient lock open from below. No one fully knew what waited behind that lock, but everyone knew it was old, hungry, and tied to the deepest rules of divine power. That was why the gods were moving now, and that was why every step mattered. Iris was the first to speak as they reached a wide chamber split by a line of glowing runes. She said the silence inside Olympus was not natural, because the silence was a spell built to hide movement and delay warning. Vance had not only attacked the gods, he had studied them, watched their habits, and learned how to keep them apart. He wanted the final shard because the shard was not only a key, it was also a seal. Long ago, the shard had been made to lock away the force under Olympus, and the shadow cage had been built as the only prison strong enough to hold a power that could bend god and mortal alike. Vance wanted to open that prison not to serve the darkness but to command it. He believed raw fear could be shaped into control, and he believed a god who ruled through fear would never be challenged again. Hades listened with narrowed eyes, and when Iris finished, he gave the part of the truth that had been hidden from most of them. The ancient lock below Olympus did not turn on its own. It turned because someone had fed it the right kind of power through the shadow cage. That power came from broken trust, stolen vows, and every lie Vance had built around his plan. Zeus tightened his grip on the front of his cloak because now he understood the shape of the trap. Vance was not rushing, he was preparing. Caleb then stepped forward and his voice shook at first, but he forced the words out. He said he had seen Vance in the lower passages, near a narrow bridge of black stone, and Vance had not even tried to hide the final shard. He had held it in plain view, just long enough for Caleb to see the bright inner light inside the crystal, and just long enough for Caleb to understand that Vance wanted him to deliver one last message. Caleb had refused to speak it before because he feared it would sound like a lie, but now he knew the message mattered. Vance had said that Zeus could save Olympus only if he came alone. That was the bait, that was the trap. And that was the reason Caleb mattered, because he had been close enough to see the lie and survive it. Zeus did not answer at once. He looked at Caleb, and the boy in the torn silver cloak met his gaze with a courage that looked small only because the world around him was so large. Zeus then did something that changed the shape of the night. He handed Caleb a small bronze seal from the inside of his cloak, a simple mark of trust that meant Caleb could speak in his name if the paths split. It was not a crown, and it was not a weapon, but it mattered more than both because it meant Caleb was no longer just a servant waiting for orders. He was part of the choice. Caleb felt the weight of it and almost dropped it because he had never been trusted like that before, and he did not know if he deserved it. But Zeus said the simple truth that held the moment together. Trust was not given because someone had already proven everything. Trust was given because the world could not be saved without risk. That was the first change in Caleb, and it was plain to see. He stood straighter, and the shame in his worn face began to fade. Then Iris moved to the rune line and placed her hand on the glowing marks. Her rainbow-trimmed robe caught the pale light, and for a moment she looked like a bridge between hope and warning. She whispered that the lower passages were waking, and the runes responded with a soft pulse. Hades crouched beside a cracked floor tile and studied the dark lines crossing it. He saw something others had missed. The shadows were not leaking upward from below, they were being drawn almost gently toward a point deeper in the mountain. That point was not the cage itself, it was the lock. Hades rose slowly and said Vance had found a way to speak to the ancient prison before opening it. That meant the prison still had some power left, and it also meant the prison could be persuaded if the right force reached it first. Zeus heard this and understood the next move immediately. They did not need to win a battle yet. They needed to reach the lock before Vance did, so the group moved again down another stairway cut into the mountain heart where the walls narrowed and the air grew thick with shadow. Every torch they passed bent strangely as if the darkness wanted to hide their path. Far ahead they heard a dull metallic sound, deep and slow, and it made Caleb flinch. He knew that sound. It came from the lower chamber where Vance had been working. Then something unexpected happened, and the truth became sharper than before. One of the side walls split open with a harsh crack, and from the gap poured a stream of black smoke that curled into the shape of a human face. It was not a full body, only a shade, but the shade carried a voice that sounded like Vance, calm and cold and almost amused. He thanked them for coming closer because he had grown tired of waiting alone. He said the gods had finally learned to look at him, but they still did not understand him. He had not wanted chaos for its own sake. He wanted a world where fear could no longer be used against him, because he had once been trapped by fear himself. Long ago, before the silence over Olympus, Vance had been a keeper of hidden passages beneath the mountain, and he had watched the gods ignore the lower halls, the forgotten servants, and the weak. He had decided that only a force strong enough to humble the gods could remake the world. That was his motive, and it was dangerous because it made sense to him. He believed mercy was a lie and control was the only safety. The shade then pointed toward Caleb and laughed softly, saying the boy had already helped more than he knew. Caleb froze because he suddenly understood that Vance had let him escape once before on purpose. Vance had wanted him to lead the gods here. That revelation hit the group hard, and for a brief moment no one spoke. Caleb felt the shame return, but this time it came with anger, because being used hurt more than being afraid. Zeus saw the change in him and stepped closer, not to comfort him with empty words, but to give him a task. He told Caleb to remember the halls, the turns, and the sounds from below. If Vance had used him once, then Caleb could use that memory back. Iris nodded and said she would carry that warning through every corridor if needed. Hades then reached into the dark and touched the smoke shade with 2 fingers, forcing it to ripple. He understood the shadow craft now. The shade was a message anchored in Vance's own power, which meant the enemy was nearby, confident, and still busy with the final stage of his plan. The gods had seen the enemy clearly at last, but the clear sight only sharpened the danger. Above them, the ancient lock turned again, this time with a sound like huge stone gears grinding against each other. The chamber shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. The runes on the floor flared bright, then dimmed, then flared again, as if the mountain itself could not decide whether to resist or surrender. Zeus raised his head and felt the pressure shift under his feet. The force below was waking faster now, and the shadow cage was nearly ready to open. He told Iris to keep the path lit, told Hades to watch the shadows for any sign of a breach, and told Caleb to stay close because the boy had become more important than he knew. Caleb nodded once, and this time he did not look away. He was still injured, still uncertain, and still young, but he had chosen to stand with them. That was his second change, and it made him stronger than before. Together they moved into the deeper corridor where the walls were lined with silver cracks and old warning marks. At the end of the hall, far beyond the reach of the torchlight, a dark chamber waited with a low, pulsing glow. Vance was there, somewhere beyond the next turn, holding the final shard and shaping the last steps of his trap. The battle had not ended, and no one dared believe it would be easy, but the gods were no longer blind, and the enemy no longer hid in mystery. The lock was turning, the shadow cage was almost ready, and Zeus, with his new trust and his rising fear, led the way forward into the dark, ready to meet what waited next. The lower chambers of Olympus felt colder with every step, and the broken stone arches threw long black shadows across the floor. Narrow stairs twisted downward, glowing runes blinked weakly from the walls, and the silence rune line still held in places, swallowing every footstep and every breath that moved too fast. Zeus walked at the front with his deep blue and gold cloak sweeping behind him, his thick white hair catching the torchlight, and his sharp blue eyes fixed on the dark turn ahead. Iris followed close beside him, calm and bright, her golden hair shining softly under the dim light, while Hades moved at the rear in his dark robe, black hair falling near his pale face as he watched for danger in the deep stone halls. Caleb came with them too, his dark brown hair messy around a worn and injured face, his torn silver cloak hanging from one shoulder, and his steps careful because every stone seemed ready to betray him. The danger was clear now. Vance was somewhere ahead with the final shard, and if he finished the shadow cage before they reached him, he could seal divine power inside it and turn Olympus into a prison of fear. That was the heart of the problem, and Zeus knew it. If Vance won here, the gods would not only lose a battle, they would lose the right to stand together at all. Zeus slowed at the edge of the next corridor, and the others stopped with him. The air there felt wrong, like sound itself had been drained away, and a wall of carved stone symbols shivered with pale light. Hades studied it first, his tired eyes narrowing as he reached toward the runes without touching them. He was the lord of the underworld, serious and steady, and he had not come to Olympus for pride or praise. He had come because the balance between the worlds mattered, and Vance threatened that balance with every stolen shard and every hidden lock. "This is a silence rune line," Hades said in a low voice. "It hides movement and swallows speech. Vance wants us blind and split before he strikes." Iris looked over the symbols and answered with quiet strength, because she was more than a messenger now. She wanted peace, but she had learned that peace without courage was only a thin mask. "Then he expects fear to do the work for him," she said. Zeus tightened his hand around his weapon and looked at Caleb. The young man had been trapped in Olympus service for too long, forced to carry messages and secrets for people who never trusted him, and that made him matter more than anyone had first guessed. Caleb wanted one thing above all else: to prove that he was more than a prisoner moving through other people's plans. He lifted his chin and his worn face hardened. "I know the lower doors," he said. "Vance used me before, but I heard enough to understand where he must be working." Zeus did not speak right away. Trust had not come easily to him, and fear still pressed at his chest, but he saw the truth in Caleb's eyes. So Zeus reached into his cloak, pulled out a small round bronze seal, plain and worn, and placed it in Caleb's hand. "Then speak in my name if you must," Zeus said. "If you are standing with us, everyone below this hall will know it." Caleb stared at the seal as if it weighed more than bronze, then nodded once and held it like a vow. They moved through the chamber line by line, careful and silent, until the floor opened into a larger hall with a low, pulsing glow in the distance. The light came from deep inside a half-built frame of black beams and silver cracks, tall as a gate and ugly as a wound. The shadow cage was there, and even unfinished, it already felt like a threat with a mind of its own. Dark energy curled around it in thin strands, and every pulse made the walls tremble. Vance stood before it in a long, dark cloak, pale hair falling near his sharp eyes, his cold face calm in the way only truly dangerous people can be calm. He was not rushing. He was not shouting. He was shaping the final steps of the trap, because he wanted the gods to arrive at the worst possible moment and see that resistance had already become too late. In one lifted hand, the final shard floated and turned, bright and fragile, shining with a sacred light that looked almost too pure for the room around it. Vance was trying to use that shard to lock the cage and awaken the force inside it at the same time. His motive was now plain. He did not want to destroy Olympus in one loud strike. He wanted to break the gods slowly, prove that unity could be bent, then use their fear to rule what remained. He wanted a world where power bowed to control. Then the air near the cage shifted, and a smoke shade rose from the floor like a dark human face with no body at all. It hovered above Vance and spoke in a thin, cold voice that carried his warning from below. "You came exactly when I expected," the shadow said, and its hollow eyes turned toward Zeus. "The trap is ready, and the lock is almost turned." For a moment, the whole hall seemed to hold its breath. Zeus stepped forward, his cloak dragging over the stone, his white hair bright against the dark room, and anger flashed across his face. But this was not the blind anger of before. This was anger shaped by trust, and that made it sharper. Iris moved to his side, her rainbow-trimmed robe catching the glow as she raised her hands and watched the cage with careful eyes. Hades took one step forward as well, and the shadows around his feet deepened, not as a threat, but as a warning that he would not let the lower chambers be taken. Caleb stayed just behind Zeus, gripping the bronze seal and staring at the final shard with a strange, shocked understanding. He had seen enough of Vance to know the truth now. The villain had used him before, not because he needed a servant, but because he wanted a witness who could be frightened into silence. That was the trick hidden inside the trap. Vance was not only building a prison for divine power. He was building a prison for trust. Zeus finally understood why Vance had hidden so much and moved so carefully. Every delay had been meant to make the gods doubt one another. Every false clue had been meant to make them turn away from the next ally. If one of them broke, the others would fall after. Zeus lifted his weapon and spoke across the hall, his voice steady now, even in the deep shadow. "You wanted us divided, Vance. You wanted us afraid of each other. Vance did not smile, but his eyes narrowed with quiet approval, as if Zeus had finally reached the level he wanted. "Fear is honest," Vance answered. "Trust is fragile. I only made the stronger thing visible." Then he turned the final shard slowly, and the shadow cage answered with a heavier pulse. The black beams brightened, the silver cracks flared, and the chamber began to shake in slow waves. Caleb suddenly stepped forward, and that choice changed everything. He raised the bronze seal high, and his voice rang out through the hall, clear and strong. "By Zeus, this path is under command of Olympus." The words broke the silence rune line behind them, and the spell of hiding cracked like thin ice. Hidden movement in the side halls stirred at once, because Caleb had uncovered the secret Vance had been using. There were more roots than anyone knew, and the lower chambers were not empty after all. The revelation hit harder than any strike, because it showed that Vance had been planning for a second force all along. He had hidden watchers inside the lower halls, not as soldiers, but as frightened servants bound by promise and silence. They did not rush out to attack when the seal broke. They hesitated, and that hesitation gave Zeus his chance. Iris turned first, calling to them with a clear and gentle voice, telling them that Olympus had not forgotten them. Hades spread one hand, and the shadows around the hall shifted into a wide, calm ring, keeping panic from spreading too fast. Zeus understood at once that the fight was no longer only against Vance. It was against the fear Vance had planted inside everyone who had been forced to serve him. So Zeus made a choice that changed his path. He did not charge the shadow cage. He did not waste strength trying to crush the final shard by force. Instead, he ordered Caleb to guide the hidden servants out through the side passages, and he told Iris to keep their fear from turning into chaos. Then Zeus stepped straight toward Vance, not with rage alone, but with trust behind him, and that trust made him stronger than before. Vance finally moved back from the cage, his calm face tightening for the first time, because Zeus had refused the trap exactly as he had not expected. The shadow cage still stood, still pulsed, and the final shard still hovered in Vance's hand, but now the room had changed. The villain's plan was exposed, the hidden halls were stirring. And the gods had learned that this battle would not be won by strength alone, but by standing together when darkness tried to split them apart. Zeus raised his weapon higher, Hades stepped in from one side, Iris gathered light in her hands, and Caleb disappeared into the side passage with the bronze seal held close. Vance lifted the shard toward the cage one more time, and the whole chamber filled with a deeper, more dangerous glow. The lock was almost complete, but not yet finished. Zeus stared into that light, knowing the next move would decide everything, and the story of Olympus held itself on the edge of the dark, waiting for the next turn. The lower chambers of Olympus felt like the inside of a sealed storm, where broken arches leaned over narrow steps and old runes glowed with a tired blue light. Cold air moved through the stone halls, and every sound seemed smaller there, as if the mountain itself was listening. Deep below the shining world above, Zeus stood in a wide chamber of cracked marble and black shadow, with his thick white hair lit by the dangerous glow of the final shard. He was the king of the gods, strong, proud, and used to command, but this night forced him into a different kind of strength. He had to protect Olympus from Vance, a pale-haired man in a long dark cloak who wanted to finish the lock on the shadow cage and trap divine power behind it. Vance believed order mattered more than freedom, and he thought the gods should be chained before their strength tore the world apart. That belief made him dangerous because he was calm, patient, and fully convinced he was right. Iris stood near Zeus with her golden hair shining in the dim light, her rainbow-trimmed robe drifting around her like a soft banner of hope. She was a messenger of the gods, calm under pressure, and she wanted only one thing now, to keep Olympus from falling into silence and fear. Hades stood on the other side, his black hair falling around a tired face that still held steady force. He was serious, quiet, and hard to read, but he had stepped into this fight because he understood what waited in the dark when power was locked away. The central conflict was clear now. If Vance completed the seal, the shadow cage would wake fully and swallow the freedom of Olympus. If Zeus failed here, the gods would lose more than a battle because they might lose their voice, their movement, and their future. Vance lifted the shard higher, and the glow from the cage answered at once, deepening into a rich, dangerous red gold that crawled over the stone floor. The silver cracks in the black prison widened a little, and the air trembled around them. Zeus raised his weapon and took one slow step forward, but Hades moved at the same time, cutting in from one side with grim purpose. Iris gathered a bright sphere of light in both hands, her face tight with focus, and the light from her palms pushed back the darkness just enough to show the shape of Vance's plan. He was not trying to destroy Olympus in the open. He was trying to seal it, quiet it, and control it from below. That was the twist hidden inside his cold patience. Vance had once served in the halls of Olympus, and he had watched the gods argue, clash, and leave their duties unfinished. He had decided that freedom always led to weakness, so he built his path around fear and control. He had gathered the final shard not to awaken chaos, but to bind it, and then use the cage as a prison for anyone who resisted him. Caleb, the young man with dark brown hair and a torn silver cloak, had heard enough of that truth in the side passage to understand the stakes. He had looked injured and worn before, but now he also looked determined, because he knew he had to carry the bronze seal through the hidden halls and prove that Zeus still trusted him. The small bronze mark in his hand was plain and worn, yet it mattered more than gold, because it told every loyal guard and every hidden watcher that Caleb spoke with the voice of Zeus. That trust gave Caleb courage, and it changed him from a frightened servant into a true messenger of Olympus. He ran through the narrow passage as the chamber behind him shook with another surge of power. The silence rune lines stretched across the stone like a glowing barrier of ancient symbols, muting his footsteps and hiding the sound of his breath. That rune line had been placed long ago for secret movement under Olympus, and now it helped Caleb move unseen through the lower halls. He kept one hand on the bronze seal and the other against the wall as the path twisted downward. Ahead of him, broken steps led to a lower vault where an old gate had once held relics, allies, and warnings from older ages. Caleb did not fully understand every secret of the lower chambers, but he understood this much. If he could reach the hidden relay stone before the cage closed, he could send Zeus a path through the silence and break the lock from its weakest side. Back in the main chamber, Vance noticed the pressure change at once. His sharp eyes narrowed and a small smile touched his face because he knew someone had escaped with the seal. He lifted his free hand, and from the shadow behind him a smoke shade formed, a dark floating face with no body, only pale edges and a cold stare. It drifted through the air like a warning made of mist, and when it spoke, its voice sounded flat and empty. It told Vance that Caleb was moving through the lower route and that the bronze seal had not been stopped. That revelation sharpened the danger because now Vance knew his control was slipping. He turned his full attention back to Zeus, and the chamber suddenly felt smaller, tighter, and more violent in its stillness. "Too late," Vance said, his voice low and calm because he believed time belonged to him. "Your servant is already walking into my walls." Zeus answered by driving his weapon down into the stone, and a burst of blue force spread across the floor in a hard circle. The shock did not break the cage, but it forced Vance back a step and shook the shard in his hand. Iris used that opening at once. She sent her light forward in a clean wave that struck the smoke shade and split it into drifting pieces of gray mist. Hades moved with quiet speed, his dark robe sweeping around him as he slammed his palm against the nearest cracked pillar. The pillar groaned and blocked one path of shadow energy, forcing the power to reroute through the center of the room. For a moment, the three of them stood together in the same rhythm, and the whole chamber seemed to breathe again. But Vance only used that moment to smile wider. He had wanted them to act because every move they made would reveal where they were strongest. He had studied the lower chambers for years, and he had hidden the final shard root inside the old runes. Then he spoke the deeper truth that changed everything. The shadow cage had not been built by strangers. It had been built long ago by terrified gods who feared what would happen if Olympus ever lost control of its own power. Vance had found the old design and made it his own because he believed the same fear still ruled the world. That was his motive, and it made sense in a cold, broken way. He was not a madman screaming for chaos. He was a man who believed fear was wiser than trust, and that conviction made him harder to fight. Zeus felt that truth strike like ice because it meant the enemy had built his trap from the fear of Olympus itself. For one short breath, doubt pressed into him. He had ruled with thunder, judgment, and force, but here in the lower chambers, force alone was not enough. He looked at Iris, who held her light steady even as the room shook, and at Hades, who stood firm despite the dark pressure around him. They were not strong in the same way, but they were strong together. That sight pushed Zeus forward again. He understood then that a king did not always win by standing alone. Sometimes the true move was trust. He called out to Caleb through the rune line, using the bronze seal as a promise. "Keep moving. We will hold him here." At the same time, Caleb reached the lower vault and found the relay stone, a flat block marked with the same ancient symbols that lined the silence route. He pressed the bronze seal into its center, and the stone answered with a soft ring that carried through the hidden halls. A narrow path of light opened on the wall behind Zeus, showing a weak point in the shadow cage. Iris saw it first. Her bright eyes widened, and she shouted the warning just as Vance drove the final shard toward the cage again. Zeus turned, Hades stepped in, and the two of them struck together, one with divine force and one with dark steady power, crashing their attacks against the shard at the exact moment the new path of light opened. The impact did not end the danger, but it cracked the lock before it could finish, and the cage shuddered hard enough to throw shadows across every wall. Vance staggered back, stunned for the first time, while the chamber filled with broken light and deep falling dark. The battle was not over, and no one believed it was, yet now the side of Olympus that had felt trapped and silent had begun to answer. Caleb had proven himself, Iris had held the line with hope, Hades had stood where others would not, and Zeus had learned that trust could carry more power than fear. As the final shard hovered above the cage in a wavering glow, the path ahead stayed open, and the next choice waited in the dark, ready to decide whether Olympus would be ruled by chains or by courage. The lower chambers of Olympus felt colder now, as broken stone arches leaned over narrow stairs and glowing runes pulsed like quiet warning lights. The silence rune line still covered the deepest hall, and it made every step feel careful, small, and hard to trust. Above the stone floor, the final shard hovered in a thin, bright glow, and the shadow cage below it shivered inside its black beams and silver cracks. Zeus stood at the front with thick white hair, sharp blue eyes, and a deep blue and gold cloak that made him look like a king who had finally learned how much his people mattered. Iris stood near his shoulder with golden hair, bright eyes, and a flowing robe trimmed in rainbow colors, and her calm face kept the room from falling into panic. Hades waited on the other side, with black hair, pale skin, and a dark robe that blended into the shadows, while Caleb stood forward with dark brown hair, a torn silver cloak, and a worn face that still carried stubborn fire. Everyone knew the problem now. If the final shard locked into the shadow cage the wrong way, the prison would not just hold power. It would wake something old, hidden, and dangerous inside the dark stone beneath Olympus, and Vance wanted that power because he believed fear made better rulers than hope. Vance did not stand in the open because he never needed to. He was a dangerous man with pale hair, sharp eyes, and a long dark cloak, and his cold, controlled face showed a patience that made him more frightening than any loud threat. He believed Olympus should be quiet, ordered, and easy to command, with every god and servant kept in place by fear of what might happen if they resisted. He had used the silence rune line to hide movement in the lower halls, he had sent shadows to listen, and he had turned the cage into a trap that would reward obedience and punish doubt. Now he wanted the final shard because it could seal ancient divine forces or awaken them, depending on the hand that guided it. He had already shown that he understood one bitter truth. A frightened kingdom will obey a hidden voice before it trusts an honest one. That was why he wanted Caleb not as an enemy but as a tool, because Caleb knew the lower halls and could move through them without drawing attention. Vance had once tried to break him with lies and pressure, but Caleb had survived that pressure, and now he stood at Zeus' side with a steady jaw and a tired but unbroken heart. Then the shadow cage gave a low pulse, and the final shard answered with a sharper light. The glow spread across the floor, touched the broken stairs, and climbed the walls in thin lines of silver blue. Iris lifted her hands at once and said, with a voice that stayed soft but strong, that the shard was reacting to something beneath the chamber, not just to the cage itself. Hades looked down at the stone, and he said that the underworld tunnels below Olympus always carried old echoes, and that some doors never stayed closed forever. Zeus narrowed his eyes because he felt it too, a pressure moving under the floor like a sleeping giant turning in its rest. Caleb stared at the cage and then at a crack in the wall near the silence rune line. He said that there was a hidden passage there, one that Vance had used before to send orders into the lower rooms, and that the rune line could mute sound but could not hide the smell of smoke or the cold draft of moving air. That was the first twist of the night. Vance had not only built a prison, he had built a listening web, and the lower chambers were far more open to him than anyone had guessed. Zeus understood the danger at once, because if Vance reached the shard first, he could direct its power straight into the cage and force open the ancient force below. That would not only threaten Olympus. It would turn the whole divine order into something brittle and easy to break. So Zeus made the choice that changed the shape of the moment. He turned to Caleb and gave him a plain, worn bronze seal, pressing it into the younger man's hand like a promise made real. Caleb looked shocked because the seal meant Zeus trusted him to speak in his name even if others still doubted him. Zeus told him to go through the side passage, find the source of the hidden draft, and watch for Vance before he could move the shard into place. Caleb nodded once and the look on his face changed from pain to purpose. Iris stepped close and touched the seal with 2 fingers, then told Caleb that hope was not weakness, and that courage often began as one small step taken in the dark. Hades gave a short nod of approval and said that if Caleb found the hidden route, he should mark every turn, because the lower chambers were built to confuse even careful minds. Caleb moved at once, slipping through the cracked stone with the bronze seal held tight in his hand, and the sight of him leaving made Zeus feel the weight of trust in a new way. Trust was not blind. It was a risk taken for the right reason. And that risk now had to hold because the chamber began to shake, and the shadow cage started to answer from inside with a deep, slow hum that made even Iris step back. The hidden passage led Caleb into a narrow run of black stone and old dust, where the silence rune line weakened and the air felt sharp against his skin. He kept low, moving past narrow stairs and dim blue marks carved into the wall until he saw them. Vance had placed a smoke shade at the end of the corridor, a dark floating shadow shaped like a human face with no body beneath it. It watched him with a cold, flat expression, and then Vance himself appeared behind it, not in full form at first, but as a voice that seemed to rise from the smoke. He said that Zeus was too late, that trust always failed when fear had enough time, and that the shard would soon belong to the shadow cage. Caleb held the bronze seal higher, and his voice did not shake when he answered that Olympus was not built for cowards who hid behind silence. That answer mattered because Caleb had once believed he was only a servant with no power of his own. Now he stood as a messenger for the king of the gods, and that change made him dangerous to Vance in a way no weapon could. The smoke shade lurched forward, trying to blur his path and drown the hall in confusion, but the bronze seal flashed once with a warm bronze glow, and the hidden runes around the passage answered. The smoke shade broke apart into thin shadows and drifted away, and Caleb kept going, even while the floor trembled harder under his boots. Back in the main chamber, Iris felt the trembling through her feet before she saw the crack move across the base of the shadow cage. She turned to Zeus and said the cage was not just holding power. It was feeding on silence, and Vance had built it to grow stronger each time fear spread through the chamber. That was the second revelation, and it made everything clearer. Vance did not want a quick victory. He wanted Olympus to doubt itself until the gods and servants turned on each other, because a divided realm would hand him control without a long fight. Zeus lifted his head and looked at Hades, and for the first time, the king of Olympus did not ask for obedience. He asked for help. Hades stepped forward at once, black hair falling across his pale face, and he placed one steady hand near the shadow cage without touching it. He said the underworld always punished arrogance, but it also rewarded those who understood balance. Then he warned that if the final shard entered the cage before Caleb found the hidden passage, the chamber would lock into a cycle of silence and shadow that even gods would struggle to undo. Zeus felt the truth in those words, and he finally understood that his greatest strength was not force, but the people standing beside him. So Zeus gave the order to act together. Iris would keep the final shard steady with her bright calm, Hades would watch the cage and hold back the dark pressure, and Zeus would strike the stone floor at the right mark to break the false seal that Vance had hidden beneath the chamber. Caleb from the passage would find the anchor point and expose the trick. Each task depended on the others, and the whole plan would fail if one person chose fear instead of trust. They moved at once. Iris lifted her hands and held the shard in a gentle ring of light, keeping it from dropping into the cage too soon. Hades called on the quiet strength of the underworld, and the dark pressure around the prison began to slow. Zeus brought his power down in one focused air, and the floor split open with a flash of gold that did not destroy the chamber, but revealed the thin black thread beneath it. Caleb reached the anchor point at the same time, tore away a small stone plate, and exposed the hidden channel that fed the cage. The chamber roared with broken magic, and the shadow cage lurched hard as its secret support collapsed. Vance stepped out fully from the smoke now, his pale hair shining in the dark, his sharp eyes wide with anger for the first time. He had not expected trust to work. He had not expected a servant, a messenger, a lord of the underworld, and a king of Olympus to move as one. The cage did not fall, but it cracked wider, and the final shard spun above it in a wild, unstable circle. Zeus stood between Vance and the shard, his cloak dragging through the light, and he knew this was not the end. It was the moment before the next break, the moment when Olympus could still choose its future. And as Vance raised one hand and the shadows thickened again, Caleb shouted from the passage that he had found something hidden below the seal, a second chamber, still closed, still waiting, and whatever rested there had just begun to wake. Zeus turned toward that new threat. Iris kept the light alive, Hades tightened his guard, and the path ahead opened wider into the dark. The lower chambers of Olympus felt colder now, as if the stone itself had started to hold its breath. Broken arches leaned over narrow stairs, old runes glowed in weak lines, and the air carried the same strange pressure that comes before a storm breaks over a city. Zeus stood at the front with his thick white hair catching the dim light, his blue and gold cloak moving like a banner in a hard wind, while Iris stayed close at his side with her golden hair shining softly through the dark, and Hades watched the rear with his black hair and tired eyes fixed on every shifting shadow. Caleb, young and shaken but still standing, pressed one hand to the wall of stone where he had felt the hidden pull, because he was the first to notice that the silence in this place was not natural, and that silence mattered now more than ever. The final shard floated near Zeus like a small star made of glass and fire, its sharp edges glowing with sacred light, and everyone knew the same hard truth. If Vance reached the second chamber first, whatever slept below could be turned against Olympus, and if the shard was used the wrong way, the seal could break open for good. Vance stood ahead in the gloom with pale hair, a dark cloak, and a face that showed no fear at all, only patient control, because he wanted the power under the seal for one reason above all others: to bend Olympus into a place where no one could challenge him again. He did not want chaos for its own sake, and that made him far more dangerous, because he believed that only one strong will should guide the gods, and he had chosen his own. Then he lifted one hand, and the shadows thickened into a wall between the heroes and the next hall. Iris raised both hands and sent her rainbow light forward, and the bright glow pushed back the dark wall just enough for the others to see the path ahead. Her calm face stayed steady, but her bright eyes narrowed with concern because she understood the new danger at once. This was not simple darkness. It was a shadow trap shaped by old magic, and it fed on sound, movement, and fear. Caleb looked over his shoulder and called out that he had found a second chamber hidden below the seal, but the moment the words left his mouth, the floor under him gave a low tremor. He had no time to explain more, so Zeus moved at once and placed the plain bronze seal into Caleb and said, in a voice that left no room for doubt, that he spoke now in Zeus' name and must guide the way if he found another hidden mark. Caleb stared at the bronze piece in shock, because he had spent so long feeling like a trapped servant of Olympus that trust from Zeus felt almost too heavy to hold, yet it also gave him strength, and that strength mattered because he knew the lower halls better than anyone there. He nodded once and ran ahead through the broken corridor, keeping close to the stone so his feet made less noise. Hades followed beside him with the steady patience of a man who had seen too many dark places to panic now, and his quiet voice warned that the silence rune line carved across the floor was still active, meaning that the enemy had built this place to hide movement and mute warning. That was the first clear sign that the chamber below was not an accident. It had been prepared long ago, and someone had feared what was inside enough to bury it under layers of control. Zeus felt anger rising in his chest, not wild anger, but the kind that comes when a king learns that his own house has been used like a trap. He had spent too long believing that strength alone could solve every problem, but this place was asking for more than strength. It was asking for trust, restraint, and choices that could not be undone. They reached a wide landing where the stone opened into a half-destroyed hall, and there they found the source of the trembling. A shadow cage stood in the center, tall and black, with silver cracks running across its beams like frozen lightning, and inside it flickered a weak divine pulse that was not yet fully awake. The sight made even Zeus stop for a moment, because the cage was not holding an enemy soldier or a wild spirit. It was holding a sealed force, one that had been hidden below Olympus for a long time, and the energy around it had begun to stir in response to the final shard. Caleb pointed toward a second set of marks on the wall, and Iris leaned in close and saw older symbols beneath the dust, symbols that told the same story in a cruel and simple way. The first seal had not been built only to protect Olympus. It had also been built to hide a failing prison. Vance had known this all along. That was the twist that changed everything. He had not come merely to steal power. He had come because he knew the lower chamber held a buried divine force that could be awakened, and he wanted to be the one who controlled it before the prison failed on its own. That made the danger worse because if the cage collapsed without guidance, the thing inside could pour its strength through the lower chambers and tear the whole passage system apart. Hades lowered his gaze and said that the old gods had once locked away many things here, not out of fear alone, but because some powers were too unstable to face in open daylight. Iris understood at once why this mattered. If the chamber below woke in the wrong hands, it would not just damage stone. It could reshape the balance of Olympus itself. Then Vance stepped out of the shadows with a calm smile and spoke from behind the broken arch, saying that Zeus always confused protection with control, and that a wiser ruler would use a hidden power instead of locking it away forever. His words were smooth, but his motive was now clear to everyone. He wanted to take the buried force, use the final shard to either open or command it, and prove that only his cold patience could hold Olympus together. Zeus answered by raising his hand and calling lightning into the cracked ceiling, but the current struck the dark beams of the shadow cage and scattered into black sparks. The cage was built to resist divine force, and the room shook harder at the clash. Caleb did not run this time. He stepped in front of the hidden wall and used the bronze seal to press against one ancient mark that had only now begun to glow. The stone answered with a low sound, and a narrow seam opened beside the cage. From deep within the gap came a cold breath and then a voice, low and fragmented, like something waking after a very long sleep. The sound was not a threat yet, but it carried enough power to make Iris tighten her grip on the light. Zeus felt the final shard pulse in his hand, and for one short moment he understood the real choice in front of him. If he forced the shard into the seal, he might shut the chamber forever, but he might also trap a power that the gods would need later. If he used it too loosely, the chamber could open wider and let the force wake fully. There was no perfect answer, only a path that had to be chosen with care. That was when Vance revealed his final move. He sent a smoke shade sliding along the floor, a dark face made of floating shadow, and it drifted toward Caleb with a warning that chilled the whole hall. The shape whispered that the chamber was not just waking, it was listening. The message meant that something inside had already learned their presence, and Vance had expected that response. He had been testing the old lock, waiting for the awakening, and now he was closer than ever to taking control. Hades moved first, stepping between the smoke shade and Caleb, and his steady presence cut through the fear long enough for Iris to flood the hall with bright color. The shadow face broke apart under the light, but the echo of its warning remained. Zeus looked to Caleb, who was breathing hard but still holding his ground, and saw the boy he had once treated as only a helper now standing like a true guardian. Caleb in turn looked back at Zeus and understood that trust was not a gift for the strong alone. It was a duty they had to earn again and again. So Zeus made a choice. He did not force the final shard into the seal. He lifted it high, spoke words of command that shook the dust from the ceiling, and used the shard to steady the silver cracks in the shadow cage instead. The light spread across the broken beams, slowing the tremor, calming the pulse, and buying the hero's precious time. Vance frowned for the first time because his plan had not failed, but it had also not succeeded, and that small gap was enough for Zeus to step forward. The chamber below was still waking, the cage was still unstable, and the shadows had not yet stopped moving, but now the heroes had a path. It was a narrow path, and it led deeper into the dark, where the real truth of the sealed chamber was still waiting. Zeus stood with Iris, Hades, and Caleb at his side, and for the first time since this long descent began, they were not simply surviving. They were choosing the future of Olympus together. And somewhere beyond the broken stone, behind the silver cracks and the sleeping force, the hidden chamber opened one breath wider, as if it had finally heard their answer. The lower chambers of Olympus felt colder now, as if the stone itself had started to hold its breath. Broken arches leaned over the narrow path, and the glowing runes along the floor cast thin bands of light across the dark walls. Zeus walked first with his blue and gold cloak dragging behind him, his thick white hair catching the dim glow, while Iris stayed close with her rainbow-trimmed robe brushing the ground in soft color. Hades followed in silence, his black hair shadowing a tired but steady face, and Caleb came behind them with his torn silver cloak hanging loose over an injured shoulder. They were not moving like lost travelers anymore. They were moving like a team, and that was what made the darkness feel different. The problem was now plain to all of them. The hidden chamber had opened wider, a sleeping force was stirring, and if Vance reached it first, he could turn Olympus into a prison built on fear. Zeus knew that would not just harm the gods, it would crush every promise Olympus had ever made to the world above. So the path ahead was no longer about surviving the maze. It was about stopping a man who believed control was worth any cost. They reached a wall where ancient marks ran in a straight line from stone to stone. Iris lifted her hand and the air shimmered as she traced the symbols with careful fingers. "This is a silence rune line," she said, her voice low and clear. "It hides movement and it swallows sound. Someone used it to keep this passage secret." That warning made Caleb glance back at the dark behind them. He was a young servant of Olympus, and only hours ago he had looked like a trapped boy with no place in this war. Now he stood straighter because Zeus had given him a real task, and that task gave him a reason to matter. Hades knelt beside the runes and pressed 2 fingers to the stone. His pale skin looked almost gray in the low light, and his tired eyes narrowed with old memory. "These marks were not placed to protect the chamber," he said. "They were placed to protect whoever came after it." Zeus turned toward him. "Explain." Hades rose slowly, and his dark robe whispered against the floor. "The lower chambers were built long ago to hold what the gods feared most. Not a beast, not a weapon, but a bond. If that bond breaks wrong, the sleeping force inside the sealed chamber can answer any voice that speaks to it with enough authority." The words settled hard in the air. Iris understood first. "So Vance does not want to destroy it," she said. "He wants to command it." Hades gave a short nod. "Yes, he thinks order is mercy and mercy can be forced." Zeus felt anger rise, but he kept it steady. That was the first change in him. He was no longer raging ahead alone. He was listening, and he was letting others help carry the truth. Caleb stepped forward then, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. His face was worn, and his hair, dark brown and messy, fell across eyes that had seen too much fear for someone so young. "I found this near the broken stair," he said. "I think it belongs to you." He opened the cloth and showed the final shard, a small glowing crystal piece with sharp edges and a bright inner light. Even in the dark, it looked alive, fragile, and sacred at once. The moment Zeus saw it, he understood why Vance had been patient for so long. The final shard could seal the chamber, or it could wake what lay inside with a single mistake. Caleb had risked everything to bring it back, and that made him more than a servant now. He was part of the choice. Zeus accepted the shard with both hands, then reached into his cloak and pulled out a small round bronze mark, plain and worn from old use. He placed it in Caleb's palm. "This is a bronze seal," Zeus said. "If anyone questions your voice, they will answer to mine. You speak for me now." Caleb stared at it as if it weighed more than metal. His lips parted, but no sound came at first. Then he closed his fingers around it and bowed his head. "I will not waste it," he said. That moment mattered because trust had become a weapon stronger than fear. Vance had built his strength by keeping others small. Zeus was building something different, and that difference was beginning to show. A deep hum rolled through the stone before anyone could answer. The shadow ahead stretched, bent, and formed a face made of smoke and cold light. It had no body, only a hollow shape that watched them from the dark. Iris stepped back at once while Hades lifted one hand, ready to block whatever came next. Zeus did not move. He had seen enough fear for one journey. The smoke shade opened its mouth, and Vance's voice came through it, calm and sharp as ice. "You have chosen well by entering farther," the warning said. "The lower chambers can hear your doubt, they can hear your hope. Both of them will be used." Caleb tightened his grip on the bronze seal, and Zeus saw how close the boy was to shaking. Yet Caleb stayed where he stood. Vance's message was not a random threat, it was a test. He wanted them frightened, divided, and unsure, because a divided group could be guided like a herd. Zeus answered the smoke shade with a hard voice. "If you wanted the chamber, you should have come yourself." For a moment the smoke face twisted, almost like a smile. "I am already here," Vance said. Then the image split into thin black threads and vanished into the cracks between stones. Silence returned, but it was a dangerous silence now. Hades looked toward the narrow path ahead. "He is close," he said. "Closer than he wants us to know." Iris touched Zeus on the arm, and her calm looked stronger than the dark around them. "Then we do what he does not expect," she said. "We keep moving together." Zeus nodded, and that simple answer marked another shift in him. He was no longer standing like a lone king. He was standing like a leader who had finally accepted the strength of his allies. The path narrowed even more until the walls nearly brushed their shoulders. The broken stone gave way to smooth black slabs, and the air began to carry a strange pressure, like a storm waiting under the ground. At the end of the corridor stood the shadow cage, a tall, dark prison made of black beams and silver cracks, wrapped in unstable energy that trembled at the edges. The chamber behind it was still hidden, but now the barrier looked less like a wall and more like a warning. Caleb pointed with a careful hand. "That is where the force was kept," he whispered. "I saw guards bringing pieces of the seal here before they vanished into the lower levels." Hades stared at the cage with a face that had gone even more tired. "Then the story is worse than we thought," he said. "Someone has been feeding power into it, not to lock it shut, but to keep it ready." Zeus stepped closer, and the final shard in his hand began to glow brighter, answering the cage from a distance. The silver cracks across the prison flashed once, then spread a little farther along the black beams. Iris drew in a sharp breath. "The shard is reacting," she said. "It knows this place." That was the twist none of them had expected. The shard was not just a key, it was part of the seal itself. It had been separated on purpose, and that meant the chamber had once been guarded by someone who wanted both protection and escape built into the same trap. Zeus felt the full weight of it then. The true threat was not only the sleeping force. It was the knowledge that the gods who built this place had once been afraid of one another. A hidden war had been buried under Olympus, and now it was waking again. Behind the shadow cage, the stone wall gave a slow groan, and one more crack of silver light spread through the dark. The hidden chamber opened another breath wider, just enough for the heroes to hear a low pulse from inside. It was not a voice, not yet, but it was alive, and it was listening. Zeus raised the final shard slowly, Hades set his feet, Iris took a steady breath, and Caleb lifted the bronze seal like a promise. Somewhere deeper below, Vance was surely smiling in the dark. But this time, the heroes were not afraid of the next step. They were ready to take it, and the narrow path was leading them straight toward the truth. The lower chambers of Olympus felt cold enough to slow breath, and the stone halls seemed to listen as much as the heroes did. Broken arches leaned over narrow stairs, pale runes glowed along the walls, and the silence rune line still held the air in a strange quiet that made every movement feel heavy. Zeus led the way with his thick white hair shining under the dim light, his blue cloak moving like a royal banner, while Iris followed close behind with her golden hair bright against her rainbow-trimmed robe. Hades walked with his black hair falling near his pale face, calm and tired but alert, and Caleb stayed near the center with his dark brown hair messy, his torn silver cloak brushing the stone as he carried the bronze seal in both hands. Above them, the narrow path had just widened enough for the group to hear that low pulse from inside the hidden darkness, and now they stepped forward because the truth below Olympus mattered more than fear. Zeus raised the final shard higher, and the small crystal piece threw clean light over the nearest arch and the cracked floor. The final shard trembled once as if it recognized the pulse ahead, and its light answered the deeper beat in a way that made Hades narrow his eyes. Caleb looked at Zeus, then at the bronze seal, because he still did not fully understand why Zeus had trusted him with a mark of authority that plain and worn. Zeus had not given him power for comfort, but for truth, because Caleb had been a servant of Olympus long enough to know the halls, the guards, and the small hidden rules that the gods often missed. Caleb wanted to prove that he was not only a trapped messenger or a scared helper anymore. He wanted to matter. That need gave him strength now, even while his worn face showed how tired he was. Iris, who had always carried calm into danger, kept watching the walls and the floor, because her gift as a messenger was to notice what others rushed past. She wanted the truth as much as Zeus did, but she also wanted peace, and she knew that peace could not exist while Vance kept moving in the dark. Hades said little, yet his quiet strength kept the group together, because he knew that whatever waited below might be tied to old divine laws, and old laws always carried a price. They reached a stone landing where the runes grew brighter, and there the silence rune line cut across the wall like a hidden border. Caleb pointed at it first, because he had seen that kind of magic before in the lower chambers. It was used to mute footsteps, hide whispers, and keep movements secret from watchers deeper in Olympus. That meant someone had wanted this area sealed from ears as much as from eyes. Zeus studied the line, and his sharp blue eyes tightened when he saw fresh marks in the dust. Someone had passed here recently. Vance had been moving ahead of them, and he had done it with patience, not haste, because patience was his real weapon. He was a dangerous man with pale hair, sharp eyes, and a long dark cloak, and he did not rush when he could wait for fear to do the work. He wanted the power below Olympus because he believed the gods had grown careless, and he wanted to use the thing in the dark to force them into obedience. He had no interest in balance or mercy. He wanted control, and control was easier when every other heart was divided. That was why he had drawn the heroes apart before, and that was why he now hid ahead of them, letting the lower chambers do the pressure for him. Then the shadow on the far wall bent and a smoke shade formed from the darkness, taking the shape of a face without a body. Its edges wavered like black ash in wind, and when it spoke, the voice came flat and cold. "You are too late," it said, and then it turned its blank stare toward Caleb. "The seal belongs to the one who knows how to break trust." Caleb stiffened because the warning felt aimed at him on purpose, not at Zeus. Iris stepped forward with her bright eyes hard and steady, and Hades planted his feet as if he could hold the whole hall in place. Zeus did not answer with anger. He only lifted the final shard until its light touched the smoke shade, and the dark face broke apart for a moment before forming again farther back. The message was clear. Vance was watching, and he wanted doubt to enter the group before they ever reached him. They moved on through a long hall lined with broken columns and deep shadow. The sound of the pulse became stronger now, and it came through the stone like a living drum under the floor. Caleb noticed that the bronze seal had begun to warm in his hands, and he almost dropped it before realizing that the bronze mark was reacting to the hidden force below. Zeus saw that change and asked Caleb to speak plainly, because trust had to be real if they were going to survive what came next. Caleb swallowed hard, then told them what he had seen in secret service tunnels beneath Olympus. He had once been sent to carry messages between guards who never used their names, and one of those guards had spoken of a chamber where a divine force was held inside a shadow cage. The cage was not built to kill anything. It was built to contain something too old and too loud for Olympus to manage safely. Caleb had thought that was just a rumor until the bronze seal started to glow in his grip. Iris understood first, and her calm face changed as the pieces came together. The final shard, the seal, and the living pulse were all part of the same lock. Hades confirmed it with a slow nod because the underworld had taught him that some powers were not evil by nature, but became dangerous when the wrong hands tried to use them. Zeus then made the truth plain for all of them. Vance was not trying to destroy the force below. He was trying to wake it under his control and use its authority to challenge Olympus itself. That was the real danger. If Vance succeeded, Olympus could be split from within, and every oath, bond, and law that kept the gods united could collapse into fear. The hall opened into a wide chamber with shattered steps descending around a pit of black stone, and there, at the center, stood the shadow cage. It rose tall and harsh, made of dark beams and silver cracks with unstable energy leaking through every line. The low pulse came from inside it, steady and patient, like a heart that had been forced to wait for a very long time. Zeus stopped at the edge of the chamber, and even he looked small beside that prison of shadow. Iris breathed in slowly because she could feel the ancient power in the air, not as evil, but as wounded and restless. Hades stared into the cage with a grave expression because he recognized the feeling of something sealed too long. Then Vance stepped from behind a broken pillar, his pale hair catching the light like ash, his long dark cloak hanging still, and his sharp eyes full of calm satisfaction. He had wanted them here, and now the reason was plain. He needed Zeus, Hades, Iris, and Caleb all present so the final lock could be opened in front of witnesses. That way, when the chamber responded, he could twist the story and make it seem like the gods had always been weak without him. He smiled as if everything had already gone his way, then raised a hand toward the cage. "You brought the key for me," he said, looking at the bronze seal. Caleb felt his stomach turn because now he understood why Vance had not taken the seal by force. Vance had needed Caleb to carry it willingly so the old magic would accept the hand that opened the path. Zeus stepped forward at once, but the floor around the pit flared with hidden symbols, and the chamber began to shake. The shadow cage answered the disturbance with a deeper pulse, and the light in the final shard flashed once in Zeus, Iris, and Hades, as if warning them that the lock was about to break. Caleb made a choice then. He did not hide behind Zeus. He raised the bronze seal high and spoke in a clear voice, using the trust Zeus had given him. He told Vance that the seal would not serve a lie. That simple stand changed everything because the chamber paused, the runes brightened, and for one sharp moment, the face inside the shadow cage turned toward Caleb as if it had recognized him. None of them knew yet whether that trapped force was ally, weapon, or judge, but they all understood one thing at once. The next move would decide who controlled the truth below Olympus, and the narrow path was no longer safe for anyone. Vance recovered first, and his cold control returned in an instant. He lifted both hands and sent a wave of dark pressure through the chamber, not enough to crush the heroes, but enough to force them apart and break their line. Zeus braced himself and pushed back with a burst of bright power from the final shard, while Hades planted his feet and held the left side of the chamber steady. Iris moved with quick grace to Caleb, shielding him from the edge of the wave, because she understood that the bronze seal was now the most important object in the room. The shadow cage began to crack along its silver lines, and the pulse inside grew faster, more urgent, and more awake. Vance called out that the gods had hidden the truth from everyone, and for a second it almost sounded like he was speaking for justice. But Caleb saw the lie inside the words. Vance did not want justice. He wanted the fear that came after truth, because fear made people obey. Zeus saw it too, and his face hardened with old divine anger, not wild and reckless but focused and clear. He ordered the others to hold their ground while he reached toward the shard and the seal together, because he had finally understood that the chamber would not open by strength alone. It would open by agreement, and that meant the heroes had to trust one another completely. Caleb stepped into place beside Zeus, even though Vance was staring at him like a blade. Iris lifted her voice in a steady call that echoed through the lower chambers, and Hades added his quiet force to the circle around them. The shadow cage shivered, the dark beams spread apart by a finger width, and from inside came a second pulse, stronger than before, almost like a response. Vance froze just for a breath, because he had not expected the prison to answer them instead of him. That tiny pause gave the heroes their chance, and Zeus lowered the final shard toward the bronze seal as the chamber light rose around them. The truth was finally close enough to touch, but the door was only beginning to open, and whatever waited inside was about to speak. The lower chambers of Olympus glowed with broken runes, and the air felt heavy with old warning. Zeus stood tall in his deep blue cloak, his white hair bright against the shadow, while Iris watched with calm golden eyes, and Hades waited in silence with his black hair and tired face. Caleb, wounded but stubborn, held his torn silver cloak close, because he knew this prison could decide the fate of every god above them. Vance, pale and cold in his dark cloak, wanted the hidden force for himself, because he believed control was the only way to survive what came next. When the final shard touched the bronze seal, the shadow cage shivered and split with light. The beams inside spread apart, and a second pulse rolled through the chamber, stronger than before, as if something deep inside had finally heard them. Vance froze for one sharp breath, and that was all Zeus needed. He pressed the seal into place, and the chamber answered with a clear hum that pushed the darkness back from the walls. Then a smoke shade rose from the opening, thin and cold, with Vance using it to send one last warning from below. It spoke in his voice, and the words were simple. The prison was never meant to hold a weapon. It was built to hold a witness. Inside the cage was not a monster, but an ancient keeper who had seen how Vance had tried to bend Olympus for his own rise. The truth struck hard, because Vance had not come only for power. He had come to erase the only force that could expose him. Caleb stepped forward first, his face set with new courage, and he placed his trust beside Zeus without fear. Iris raised her hand, and her rainbow robe caught the light as she guided the fading runes into balance. Hades lowered his gaze, steady and sure, and locked the final seal with quiet strength. Vance tried to pull the chamber back into shadow, but the prison had already chosen. The opening closed on his claim, the smoke shade broke apart, and Vance was driven back into the dark halls below. Zeus looked at Caleb, and for the first time, Caleb stood as more than a servant. He stood as a witness, a defender, and a man who had chosen the truth over fear. In that moment, the gods of Olympus did not just seal a prison, they changed who they were meant to be.